Honorable Prime Minister, Honorable Minister of Education, Principal and Pro-Vice Chancellor, other members of your cabinet, Mr. Prime Minister, the distinguished ladies and gentlemen. Before I begin, let me thank those persons who have contributed to this lecture by supplying me with a lot of the data I will use. And I named them Delisle Worrell, Andrew Downs, Abdul Khari from ECLAC, my niece Lisa Wade, Jeffrey Kilman, Clayton Springer, and the president of BARP. They were very helpful in supplying me with the information I'm going to use. And let me thank you for the invitation to deliver this Errol Barrow Memorial Lecture. And I'm grateful for your kindness and understanding and allow me to present it after the actual date of Errol Barrow's birthday. And I'm honored to stand in a long line of distinguished persons who have paid tribute to the legacy and memory of our national hero and have explored the many facets of his enduring contribution to Barbados and things Barbadian. They've also highlighted his role as an unrepentant champion of a West Indian idea and ideal. Of course, this lecture is of special significance, since this year represents the 60th year since he parted ways with the then dominant Barbados Labour Party and founded the Democratic Labour Party. And it also marks 50 years since Barbados became independent. In my invitation, I was asked to reflect on Mr. Barrow's impact on our journey over the past 50 years, our future development, and perhaps see them through a personal lens whose focus has obviously been sharpened and shaped by the different experiences and responsibilities of my life course. I have entitled this lecture, Of Arms, the Hero, and Our Demographic Destiny, not only because Mr. Barrow is a national hero, but also an oblique reference to some history I share with him. Every, or almost every Barbadian schoolboy who would have sat in the classical sixth form at Harrison College, as Errol Barrow and I did, would have read Virgil's Aeneid, which begins, Arma virum quicano, Arma virum quicano. I sing of arms and the hero, who first came from the shores of Troy, exiled by fate and came to Italy and the Lavinian shores. Virgil's magnificent epic about the wandering of Aeneas as a result of the wrath of the jealous goddess Juno establishes the myth that bound the founding of Rome to the legend of Troy. Of course, the only temporary exile by fate that Errol Barrow suffered was in a political sense, but in a metaphorical sense, he helped to create in Barbados the successful enterprise that, like Rome, has become the cynosure of many political eyes. I retain many images of Errol Barrow. I knew him fairly well socially in the 60s when I feared him as a lawyer. He once destroyed completely my professional credibility as a witness when I was a young doctor practicing here in Barbados. I went to court as an expert witness in one case, believing in the fidelity and purity of the notes I had faithfully recorded about an altercation that had resulted in an injury. I had set down what the various actors had said and what they said had been done. And on examination by Mr. Barrow, I was reluctant to admit that there were truths other than those I had recorded. My version of the truth did not sit well with Mr. Barrow as he defended his client. He destroyed me in cross-examination. And like Justin Pilate would remind me soon after that lunch at a friend's home, that truth in law was a matter of interpretation. I have a recollection of him as the fussless prime minister. He didn't have much fuss about him. I came to consult him once on a university matter, and he received me graciously and informally on a Saturday morning in his office. But he ended our discussion giving me very sage advice, but telling me he had to cut our interview short because he had to go home to cook. I saw him last in 1979 here in Barbados when I gave the Charles Duncan O'Neill lecture on medical research in the Caribbean. He complimented me, and he made a special comment on my plea for an excellence that was not parsed by geography. I had noted the following in the lecture, and I quote, I would like to think that our medical scientists in their quest for excellence are regarding themselves as scientists from the Caribbean and not narrowly as Caribbean scientists, and it is not a semantic differential. In this matter, I agree with Arthur Lewis, who advises us to sidestep our cultural nationalists for whom our own thing is always better than other people's things. In reflecting on the basis of beliefs of that nature, and on the several other occasions on which I would analyze the growth of my own West Indian consciousness, I would conclude that I'm indeed a product of the ferment of the years when Errol Barrow fought against colonialism and won. And that victory is captured in the iconic picture of him exulting with John Snow at the Garrison on November 29, 1966, as the Union Jack came down and the broken trident went up. I could almost imagine him saying, like Martin Luther King, free at last, thank God we are free at last. I was born into the Barbados of his young adult days, a Barbados whose inequalities must have galled the Fabian socialist that he was. And I can relate his affirmation of not quite living in unity, as he recalls an image of our school with which I was quite familiar. He would say, and I quote, "We are living in a country in which you can be sitting next to a boy in Harrison College, and the evening after school, he passes you by as if he never existed. That is the kind of people you find in these islands. And we in Barbados, more than any other people in any part of the world, have exhibited how not to live together in unity." In those early days, I was acutely conscious of the racial differential, but I was equally convinced that lack of privilege did not deny me a passport to achievement. And I was made firm in my conviction by my parents that it was indeed by the sweat of my brow and with the aid of the home kerosene lamp, I could indeed eat bread. Tonight, I wish to explore how his thinking shaped and will possibly shape Barbados in at least one critical area. As it waves the willow, takes a new guard, and settles in for the next 50, conscious that the pitch has changed and will continue to change. And I believe that a memorial lecture should be about more than sentimental reminiscences. It should deal with some substantive aspect of contemporary society, all the while remembering and recognizing that we sit in the shade of the trees that others have planted. Thus, I will use this lecture, as Prime Minister Gonzalez said last year, as one important conveyance by which to ensure the continuance of his ideas and spirit and the salience of his praxis for our times and beyond. I sing of arms and the hero. The arms that he bore to transform Barbados were not arms of steel. They were ideas. They were arms of ideas. As I have grown older, I have appreciated more and more the power of ideas for change. This, of course, is not a new truth, and there are several references through time to the critical importance of ideas. I often quote a friend of mine, Julio Frank, who is now president of the University of Miami, who would say, never underestimate the power of ideas to change the ideation of those in power. Never underestimate the power of ideas to change the ideation of those in power. And Mr. Barrow would cite John Maynard Keynes on the importance and power of ideas. And he would say, indeed, the world is ruled by little else. Practical men who believe themselves to be quite exempt from the intellectual influence are actually slaves of some defunct economists. Of course, there are no defunct economists in Barbados. And sooner or later, it is ideas, not vested interests, that are for good or evil. But of course, the best ideas often meet with fierce resistance. For as a gentleman I knew, Wilfred Trotter, remarked, the most powerful antigen known to man is a new idea. It is from Errol Barrow's many speeches that one can cull the ideas that I believe stretch the minds of Barbadians, and I hope that many of them still find currency here. I've taken many of these from Yusuf Hanna's book. One of the most provocative set of ideas were put forward in his famous Mirror speech, which was described by a press aide from the former Minister Gordon Brown in very eloquent terms. And one of the critical passages of this speech for me was when he said, the soul of this community, you've heard it before, the soul of this community has to be laid bare. And there's no better time to do that than when we are preparing for independence, so that we know what we are, who we are, and where we are going. So on the basis of my previous experience as an academic and an international civil servant with a consuming passion for health, I would like to speculate on where we are going. Obviously, our capacity to go anywhere depends in large measure on who and what we are and where we are coming from. Because if we don't know our destination, we are likely to be blown off course by any prevailing wind, as Lewis Carroll would say so neatly in Alice in Wonderland. I do this while thinking of what Mr. Barrow might have said about the challenge I wish to pose that must occupy the minds of all Barbadians, and what ideas he might have put forward to find solutions. The challenges are obviously many, but tonight I wish to frame one within a concept I believe to have been fundamental to Mr. Barrow's life and work. It was the idea and the concept of social justice. And he would say, but I would like to say that the government of Barbados, which is a social democratic government, shares with the workers' organizations the same objectives. And the main social objective which we share with the workers, and why we find it easy to travel down the same road together, is the objective of social justice. Social justice cannot be achieved in a society where there's inequality and discrimination, either at the workplace or outside of it. And one of the groups in most societies, including ours, which unfortunately suffers from this inequality and discrimination, is the older persons. And it's through an exploration of local demography that we can appreciate this situation. So I wish to pose a relevant, almost rhetorical question that is very topical in developmental circles. Is our demography destiny? What is the impact of demography on the social and economic fabric of Barbados now and in the future? I'm open to correction, but I remain to be convinced that the impact of past, present, and future demographic changes has entered into the psyche of our population and is seen with the degree of urgency they merit. I find that in general, we are arrested in a concept of old age and older persons. In the world as a whole, there's discrimination against older persons. Robert Butler, a famous psychiatrist, has popularized the concept of ageism, which is similar to and equally as pernicious as racism or sexism, and derives from the tendency to stereotype human beings. Unfortunately, the stereotypes that usually inform our opinion of the older person include the belief that they're less productive, less adaptable, more rigid, and almost diseased. Seneca said, old age is a disease. It is still common to think of the older person as Shakespeare in As You Like It describes the 7 ages of man, and he ends, last scene of all, that ends this strange and eventful history, is second childishness and mere oblivion, sans teeth, sans eyes, sans taste, sans everything. And much of this stereotyping is driven by the external cultural forces which glorify youth, beauty, and vitality. It is common knowledge that life expectancy is increasing in Barbados. And perhaps evidence of this is increasing number of centenarians who are Governor General visits. In 2013, life expectancy at birth was 75.2 years for males and 80.9 years for females, with an overall 78.1 years. And Barbados ranked 39th in the world in terms of life expectancy. And when we appreciate that at independence, life expectancy was just over 63 years, and we have gained 15 years over the past 50, we must acknowledge that this is indeed a remarkable achievement. And this increase in life expectancy is derived essentially from a decrease in mortality at all ages, particularly in childhood, but in the older population as well, and a decrease in fertility. In 1966, the infant mortality rate here was 49 deaths per 1,000 live births, and now it is about 10. In 1966, fertility was almost 3 children per woman. Today, it is 1.68 children per woman. I always say I never know how a woman has 0.68 of a child, but that's what statistics are for. These are all impressive achievements, And we should pay tribute especially to those giants of public health, so people such as Carlisle Burton, Morris Bayer, Frank Ramsey, and those numerous unsung heroes, particularly the nurses and other personnel who have contributed. I would not call Mr. Barrow a public health giant in the conventional sense of the word, but our decline in fertility was in great part due to the work of the Barbados Family Planning Association. And he played a major role as Prime Minister in having the association incorporated by an Act of Parliament in June 1967. A lecture I gave some time ago, I was in error. I made an error, and I attributed this to Mr. Adams, Grantley Adams. But the story correct is that at the time, Morris Bayer took Mr. Barrow to see some women who had 5, 6 children and who were suffering from all kinds of problems. One he describes graphically with her legs all swollen and distended veins and looking many, many years older than her 30-something years. She'd had 5 children. And when Mr. Barrow spoke with them, they all said to him, "We would wish not to have so many children." Mr. Barrow was so touched that the next day he went back into the Parliament, and we know that the Act of Parliament in June 1967 was passed incorporating the Family Planning Act, because Mr. Barrow made it abundantly clear, pellucidly clear, that he believed in family planning and fertility control. This decline in infant mortality, followed by a fall in fertility, produces a transitory bulge in the young working age population, and this has been referred to as a demographic dividend. We should note, however, like any other dividend, it does not come automatically. It has to be claimed. And those countries which have benefited from the dividend are those which have put in place the kind of infrastructure to allow the increased number of young people to be productive. It is difficult to determine exactly which inputs are of greatest importance, but I would posit that the social policies, especially related to the increase of human capital through health and education, of which Mr. Barrow was particularly proud, were major factors in having Barbados take advantage of this demographic dividend. At the time free education at all levels was legislated by his government, it was an essential trampoline for upward social mobility and for producing the kinds of talent needed in a modernizing Barbados. But time and circumstances change, and I'm sure he would have been the first to acknowledge that good governance must include the capacity to review and modify social policy. In such contexts, I'm wont to quote my father, who would say that the only people who do not change their minds are the fools and the dead. The steady increase in life expectancy here is a part of a global phenomenon which is producing larger numbers of older citizens. In launching the recent World Health Report on Aging and Health, Director General of WHO Chan had this to say: at a time of unpredictable challenges for health, whether from a changing climate, emerging infectious diseases, or the next microbe that develops drug resistance, one trend is absolutely certain. The aging of populations is rapidly increasing worldwide. For the first time in history, most people can expect to live into their 60s and beyond. And the consequences for health systems, their workforce, and budgets are profound. The reality of the demographic change is that it produces increased numbers of older persons in our societies. But it's important to recognize that they will not constitute a cohort with set characteristics down the ages. Those who are considered older now are vastly different from their counterparts at independence. They have been influenced by fundamental changes in their social climate. They are in general better educated, more alive to world issues, and are technologically much more sophisticated. And if the trend continues, and I'm sure it will, the cohort of older persons will also be different when Barbados reaches its centenary. There is no evidence whatsoever that the maximum lifespan of Homo sapiens has increased over the years. But the proportion of the population that approximates it has increased and continues to increase. Aging naturally brings with it some impairments. The capacity for adaptation decreases a bit, but impairment does not necessarily lead to disability. Disability occurs when the environment is not appropriate to allow the individual to compensate for the impairment. And the degree of a disability varies obviously tremendously from individual to individual. But even greater importance is the need to counteract the false doctrine that by definition, the older persons create a drain on society because of dependency. There is now evidence that instead of being a drain on the economy, they may actually be net contributors because of their productivity and the variety of services they provide. Indeed, given the increasing productivity of the older person and the shift in the modes of production with more emphasis on knowledge work and the technological capability and less on physical strength, it is being argued that the later years may actually be producing yet another demographic dividend. Not the initial demographic dividend which I described earlier, but a new demographic dividend as the older persons come into the workforce. Our census data show that 14% of the Barbadian population is over the age of 65, a figure actually identical to that of the United States. But it's not only the number of older persons, it's also the distribution of the population that is important in terms of where we are going. The number of children less than 15 years of age reached a peak in the early 70s and has been falling steadily. In 1980, these children represented 29% of our population. And by 2010, this had fallen to 19.6% of our population. The numbers of the working age population, aged 15 to 64, increased in the second half of the last century, and after some leveling off, will also decline as the cohort of children moves through this age group. In 1980, the working age group was 60% of the population, but in 2000, it was 66.4%, and in 2010, it had increased a bit to 66.7%. But one of the most striking features in Barbados is the growth of the population older than 80 years. In 1990, this group represented 3% of the population. In 2000, it represented 3.4% of the population, and in 2010, represented 4.2% of the population. This is the fastest growing section of the Barbadian population. And these data have implications for many aspects of our lives. And one very simple example is the impact of longevity on insurance premiums. I'm told now that term life insurance is much cheaper than before. It is common to speak of the dependency ratios in relation to the position of the older population. If you take the population aged 0 to 14 and the population aged 65 plus, and you use that group of those two groups of persons in relation to the so-called working age population of 15 to 64, that is also described as a dependency ratio. But sometimes we focus on what is known as the old age dependency ratio, which is the ratio of persons over the age of 65 to the population between the ages of 15 and 64. And it's customary to think and speak of these, especially the latter, as a major cloud over a country's development. This is not a simple conundrum, as one blog put it, because the aphorism that demography is destiny is employed to support the view that rapid population growth will cause disaster. And it is also used simultaneously to support the view that stagnant to declining population growth will also cause a disaster. As he said, we are damned either way. But the question which is being asked more frequently now is, why was the age of 65 ever established as a cutoff point between the young and older population, and has been accepted more or less as an age of retirement? Dora DaCosta, in a paper on the evolution of retirement and American economic history, very interesting, points out some of the reasons why age 65 was considered as marking the beginning of old age. Apparently, the origin goes back to Otto von Bismarck, the German Chancellor, whose social insurance scheme actually based the retirement age at that age when men stopped being productive. And initially he said it was 70, then he set it back later to 65. And on Bismarck's request, Emperor William I sent a letter to Parliament which included the following sentence, which I quote: "Those who are disabled from work by age and invalidity have a well-grounded claim to care from the state, and he included those disabled from work by age and invalidity were those over the age of 65. And it's interesting to note that when age 70 was first established as the age at which Germans could retire and receive social insurance, the life expectancy was around 50. When it was lowered to 65, life expectancy at age 60 was another 14 years. And there's a famous physician, William Osler, a very famous physician, professor of medicine at Johns Hopkins, and he argued that at age 65, men had lost all mental elasticity. And the English economist William Beveridge, he proposed in 1909 that older workers lacked adaptability, which was a quality he felt was necessary in time of rapid technological change. He suggested that work should begin at 15 and end at 1965. And in arguing for the constitutionality of the Railroad Retirement Act in 1936, U.S. federal government claimed, and I like this part, it is a commonplace fact that physical activity, physical ability, mental alertness, and cooperativeness tend to fail after man is 65. These arguments all seem rather quaint now, but they have their residuum in the fact that an age around 65 is so common throughout the world as an age more or less around the age of 65 as the age of retirement and the age at which pensions and social insurance will start. It is interesting, I found, that all of the arguments set up by Bismarck, by Beveridge, by Osler, refer only to men. They never refer to the age at which women lost their adaptability, if ever. It is remarkable that the historical anachronism of linking capacity to a certain age and basing much of our data collection around this definition of the older person, as well as tying a retirement age to it, should have persisted in spite of current irrelevance of the initial thesis. There's obviously current natural concern for the ability of the Barbadian state as a whole to support the growing number of older persons as conventionally defined, with a shrinking number of persons in the working age group. At independence, there were 13.6 persons over the age of 65 for every 100 persons in the working age of 15 to 64. And the recent census figure shows that this figure has increased, and there are now over 19 older persons for every 100 workers. And national insurance expenditure on old age pensions in 2011 was 3.87% of our GDP. There's not an insignificant number. Naturally, this brings attention to the labor force participation of the older persons. And when you look at labor force participation, majority of only a very few of those persons in the older age groups are earning what we would consider very high salaries. But the data on poverty is also of relevance, and we find that, in fact, there is obviously considerable poverty among those persons who are over the age of 65. Some 19.3% of the population was classified as being below the poverty line. But this was similar for the population over the age of 60. And indeed, surprising to me, there were more of the indigent and non-indigent poor in the age range 50 to 69 than there were among those over the age of 60. There's no cause for satisfaction that poverty appears to be less among those older persons compared with any other group. The concern should be that there is poverty in Barbados at all. And while there is a potential for the younger poor to find employment, this is not an option usually open to the older persons. There were interviews with the older persons in Barbados, in the Barbados survey of living conditions. These interviews showed that they saw themselves as a social group vulnerable to poverty and vulnerable to social exclusion. It was striking to note the aspects of denial, the pride in maintaining the outward appearance, and also the lack of family and community connection bore heavily on them. It was very clear that the halcyon days of kinship care were gone or were fast disappearing. And there was evidence of poor health, poor nutrition, and the powerlessness derived from their voicelessness, which contributed to the perceived stigma and discrimination in a wide range of social settings. And as I read the Barbadian survey, one could almost hear the hooves of the horsemen, the 4 horsemen of deprivation, desolation, destitution, and devastation. You could hear those horsemen riding together. But there's a growing belief that these concepts of old age and of dependency are no longer valid. And obviously that the notion of 65 as a cutoff point for productivity should be put in the archives. I was introduced to a different approach in a symposium, an emerging market symposium, by a brilliant English demographer, Stuart Bastin, who synthesized a body of recent work on this subject. And he articulated what he described as a prospective view. And let me repeat a quote of his. To the extent that our concern with age is what it signifies about the degree of deterioration and dependence, it would seem sensible to consider the measurement of age not in terms of the years elapsed since birth, but rather in terms of the number of years remaining until death. And he proposed that we pay much more attention to prospective age, that is the age at which the remaining life expectancy is only about 15 years. This is important from the health perspective, since the costs of care are much more closely related to the proximity to death than actual age, as most of the costs for health care in all countries, and I don't believe Barbados is any different, are concentrated in the last 15 years of life. So should we think of true dependency, if that concept remains valid, as starting at that age at which one has about 15 years of life ahead? This is similar to the metric developed by WHO of health-adjusted life expectancy, which estimates the number of healthy years an individual is expected to live at birth by subtracting the years of ill health from overall life expectancy. And this concept of prospective age, of course, has its problems, because of the changes in life expectancy and the conditions in which the older population lives, and presumably the manner in which they are addressed and avoided health-damaging behavior through the life course, the age at which there were 15 years of life left would change. The other challenges, of course, should retirement and the payment of pensions begin at 65 when the age of greatest need begins much later? Should financial support to the older person be greatest in time of greatest need? In other words, should be some graduation of support? I'm sure that even the idea of these possible changes of thinking causes shocks to any society which has come to expect that the 65-year-olds have earned their pensions as a right, and it is quite vigorously argued that the time of retirement should be divorced entirely from the time of onset of dependency. It is being argued in some circles that the current, I hope not in Barbados, that the current system in which pensions are paid and the care provided for persons for a period of time that is now increasing represents a massive unjustified transfer of assets and transfer of benefits to the older persons who represent an ever-expanding part of society. And this argument, which I trust is not being mooted in Barbados, this, I'm telling you, sparks very fierce intergenerational animosity. But on a more positive note, there's a growing consensus that society as a whole should be concerned less with actual age and more with how to make aging productive, which is seeing that the older person has the possibilities of contributing to society in both economic and non-economic ways. The important issue that all societies, including Barbados, must rethink the concept of dependency beginning at age 65. There's a recent report from The Lancet questioning the readiness of developing countries to address the problems of aging. And they said that developing countries are fast running out of time to implement adequate policy solutions to cope with their aging populations. This is true, but the concern should also be with the whole life course, and attention should not be fixed exclusively on the end point, that is the older population. One of the possible causes for this was perhaps the persistence of the mistaken idea that there was still time, and somehow societies would take care of their oldest citizens. This concern is not new in Barbados, because I read a demographic study done 33 years ago, and I quote from that study is instructive. 33 years ago, this study said, as Barbados prepares to enter the 21st century, it is in a unique demographic situation. Although the country is considered a developing one, its population statistics all reflect the demographic behavior of a developed nation. Yet these changes in fertility and mortality are recent, while immigration is a historically accepted fact of life. Clearly, Barbados cannot continue to grow for much longer. The current age distribution almost guarantees that school enrollments will fall over the next 20 years, that the size of the labor force will continue to increase over the next 20 years before leveling off and then declining, and the elderly population will grow substantially and continue to grow after 2010. The gerontological issues that will emerge over 30 years typify the impact of long-run demographic changes. The fertility of one generation affects the population composition many years later. And statisticians and demographers who are aware of these predictable changes, they should take the responsibility of informing policymakers in ample time to modify future legislation in relationship to these issues. Thus, there is an urgent need for ideas of how these issues are to be addressed. And there's a need for the collective intelligence residing in the people of Barbados to do so. And in this context, I refer to the arms Mr. Barrow wielded, because he would no doubt have been seized of the importance of the issue, as he never shrank from grasping difficult problems and never was reticent in advancing his ideas. And he believed that the collective intelligence residing in the general populace was a major asset in Barbados, and especially in matters of great moment, it needed to be harnessed. This is an area in which the regional university should be involved by assisting in taking these matters to the public in the form in which it can understand and therefore contribute. And in one of his speeches, in referring to the presence of talent in the region, especially in the University of the West Indies, he bemoaned this division between those who work exclusively with their brains and those whom we think work only with their hands. Because as he said, the truth is all men and women, irrespective of occupation, have to work with their brains. And this apparent division has been a concern of universities from time immemorial. There was an era when knowledge was seen as valuable in and of itself and did not serve any utilitarian purpose. This was succeeded by the Baconian concept, by Bacon concept, that saw knowledge only in terms of its narrow instrumental value, and sometimes in recent years has tended to devalue those disciplines which were supposedly found wanting when laid in the balance of putative immediate economic relevance. Our university has demonstrated that it is concerned not only with the output of graduates and its intellectual production, but also finding methods of reaching out and involving those beyond the traditional academia. Of course, there's the inherent risk, especially in small societies, that involvement in local matters of moment can be interpreted as interfering in areas that are the province of one or other section of the state. I'm pleased, however, to note the level of official concern and response to these demographic changes. Barbados has been faithful in discharging its obligations to the official international commitments and declarations, the most notable being the famous Madrid International Plan of Action on Aging. Indeed, Barbados first responded to its own challenge in 1998 by establishing a national committee for the International Year of Older Persons. I was privileged to read the most recent iteration of the National Policy on Aging for Barbados towards a Society for All Ages, which was dated in January 31st, 2012. It's not appropriate for me to comment on it in extenso here. Suffice it to say that it's a very comprehensive response to the current situation, but only time will tell whether it is sufficient. However, several aspects struck the responsive chord in me. There's a welcome affirmation, and I quote, "It has become increasingly clear that policies relating to key developmental areas in Barbados require the input of the social partners, NGOs, and civil society in general. And this strategy is very cognizant of the need to involve those various elements of the state." And reference was made specifically to the Barbados Association of Retired Persons, which I gather is the largest non-governmental organization in Barbados dedicated to enhancing the quality of life of older persons. It is interesting that its target population is persons over the age of 55, not 65. And given its size, it must have a significant voice in policy formulation. There was a welcome recognition in the national policy of the fact that, and I quote, population aging must be a central issue on the socioeconomic agenda for Barbados, as it has significant implications for the individual, their families, communities, government, and the wider society. I was taken by the strong commitment to the health of the older person as a basic right. I believe that the rights of the older person are not intrinsically different from the rights claimed by other groups. The rights are inherent in their being citizens and are derived from their essential humanness and not from their age. The recommendations in that strategy on end-of-life care are very welcome, and particularly references to palliative care, in which I have a special interest, is one of the essential goals of medicine, that individuals should be allowed and helped to die with dignity. And there's no doubt that pain is one of the factors that prevent the older person, or anyone indeed, from dying with dignity. No person should die with pain. If I had any concern about this policy, it would be about the capacity to put into effect the wide-ranging list of very laudable recommendations which have been made. There's no price tag I could find attached to it. And from my experience, many of these inputs will demand the human and financial resources which are in short supply everywhere. There's one pertinent set of recommendations, however, which touches on education, which you know but is of special concern to Mr. Barrow. Given the increased life expectancy, and given the entry of persons into retirement who are still mentally alert and intellectually competent, it is critical that the concept of lifelong learning be inculcated into the young. This concept of lifelong yearning should be inculcated into the young. Education cannot be restricted to the traditional primary, secondary, tertiary levels. All societies have to accept that the function of the education at all levels has to make young men and women job prepared rather than being job ready, because many of them, most of them, perhaps all of them, will change their jobs several times during their their working life. So it is essential for them to be job prepared rather than ready for some specific job immediately after graduation. And all of our systems have to participate in this effort to educate the young through the life course. And this, I'm pleased to note, is a subject that is affecting the pedagogical practice in our University of the West Indies and should be part of the credo of all education institutions, especially those at a higher level. And I'm confident that our university will be more than pleased to collaborate with the government of Barbados in operationalizing those of the recommendations that fall within its remit. In that context, I would hope to see the aspect of research emphasized, as there are many areas in which the data are simply not available. Finally, is our demography destiny? I would perhaps frame it differently, as the title of my lecture suggests. Given how we live, our demographic future is pretty clear. The direction of the demographic changes is crystal clear for all to see. The population of older persons will continue to increase inexorably. The population of younger persons will continue to decline. The solution to the consequences of these changes, if I may be rash enough to offer one, is the aim at what I call the rectangularization of the life course. It should be one in which there is minimal, inevitable deterioration of function over a long life, until the time came when, after a short period of disability, there was a rapid deterioration to a relatively sudden and pain-free death. And like David, the son of Jesse, die of good old age, full of riches, full of days, riches, and honor. That the life course should be like this, and life course should not be like this. The rectangularization of the life course. As to destiny, ladies and gentlemen, let me end as I began by quoting from the Virgil's Aeneid. Let us follow our destiny, ebb or flow. Whatever may happen, we master our fortune by fully accepting it. The real task of the loyal sons and daughters of Barbados is to vow and affirm that ageism must have no place in that fortune, and to find the ways to manage these demographic changes and their consequences in such a manner that the nation grows in strength and unity. Because I believe Mr. Barrow would have asked for no less. Thank you.